Welcome to our fourth session of the Finding Your Scottish Ancestors presentations. In this one, we're going to look at where did my ancestors come from, and also we'll be looking a bit at how was it there, what sort of circumstances did they live in. You might call it the domestic life that they led. So let's move on to talk about the sort of overview of the topic. First, we're going to think about who they had clan allegiances with. That's quite important to where people lived and how they related to their neighbours. Then we'll look at how to find places on a map, what resources are available for you to use. And then we'll look at the sort of income that they have for their livelihood to survive, and the crofting life that goes with that in the earlier times. And we'll look at the sort of houses they had, the rights they had to use property, and the life in general. Of course, this is all set within the context of the scientific age of reason and the age of enlightenment. And those things eventually had an impact on the Highlanders, partly in the migrations that they made elsewhere. Now, from your feedback forms, I saw that you were interested as much in this, what sort of life they had, domestic life, as you were in locating the place where they lived. Just a reminder, if you could turn off your microphones before we start. And I suggest that during this session, you might find some tips about, it's a huge topic, you know. Many of these parts of this session we can talk about for hours at a time. So we've got limited time, and I'd like to press on with it. And I can just give you some leads to follow up. And you might like to make some notes as you go along with those leads, so you can go there and find follow up yourself. Now, looking at the very earliest of history, of course, we know that the people who lived in Britain came there after the last ice age, 7,000 odd years ago, migrated from Europe, Central Europe, and probably had a sort of Celtic way about them. The relevant parts we're talking about, the kingdom of Dalriada was there in the southwest, you know, meaning Argyll and that part of the world. Then from the late 700s onwards, you had a couple of hundred years of Norse, meaning Viking, control. You know, Viking tends to imply they just came and raped and pillaged and went away again. But of course, we're talking about them coming and settling for hundreds of years, Norse people. And then in the end of that sort of period, we have Kenneth MacAlpin, as we call him in English, uniting the Dalriada people with the Pictish people from the northwest of what we call Scotland today. And then you have, around this time, the monks from Ireland coming and converting the tribes to Christianity. And from 900 odd about onwards, you have settlers coming from the island to settle in Scotland, the west coast, and then further on, bringing with them the Irish Gaelic. And that's what the Gaelic that we call it in Scotland now is really a derivation of those people, brought with those peoples to what we call Scotland. In fact, you know, there were times when Scotland was a place in Ireland, a part of Ireland. By 1018, that's about, we have the Gaels, as they're called, meaning the Gaelic-speaking peoples, have taken control right down to the borders, meaning Edinburgh and down that way, the borders and the Lothians. And so we see many Gaelic-based names of places down there in the south of Scotland today where, you know, we don't know in our living times that there were Gaels there at all. And the Kingdom of the Isles was like a separate, lawless, some would say, but a separate part of the world, covering the west coast, the Hebrides, the small isles, and the Skye, so that you have the Kingdom of the Isles, which was really a MacDonald exercise, you know, a place where the name MacDonald relates to that. And it's a long period of a separate, really, well, you wouldn't say country, but certainly the kings of Scotland didn't have say over that area. This photo here is by a guy that I know very well. He took it only last week, and you can see it's the sunset and it's lined up along those stones there. This is the Cavendish on the west coast of Lewis. Yeah? Anybody seen the Cavendish stones? No? Yeah? You know, there they are on the longest day with the sun coming along their road. How good is that? But he's a great help to our cause there, John. I met him. So let's move on now to a more recent times. We have the British invasion, you might say, of the Normans is the big date that people in England think of, 1066. Of course, there were Norse people in Northumbria and elsewhere but they think of this 1066 and all that as being the date that the Normans arrived in Britain and took control of the south particularly. And then in due course, the King of Scotland, David I, invites the Normans to come and become the aristocrats of Scotland. And so we have these, you know, French-sounding names for the Normans. Of course, were originally Vikings too, who had gone down to Normandy and been there not very long, maybe a century or so, before they came and, well, they went first, you know, to Sicily. If anybody who's been to Sicily will know that the Normans were there in a big way before 1066. So I think it was 1047 they went to Sicily, just off the top of my head. And so you have the sort of fusing of the feudal systems from Europe of, you know, having feudal lords taking rents from peasants. And, you know, this fellow, the Lord Lion, he's the guy who gives out chiefships and things like that, is saying to, he says here, how the two systems of feudal Europe and the clan system were integrated into each other. And he says, look, without the feudal and the clan system, it wouldn't be what it is today. Everyone had to find themselves a master, and that meant some of them took the name of their master. So a lot of these people would say phrases. It would be an example. You know, they're known phrases for having handed out what a bowl of meal, it's called, meaning food, to people in exchange for them adopting the Fraser surname. So good luck with finding DNA matches with that lot. Hey, you know what I mean? And surnames, in fact, weren't much used in the early times. They were just, you know, in the Gallic way. You can read about it in a number of places. Even Wikipedia has quite a good page on it. You know, that people were called, you know, light-haired, son of light-haired John. That sort of thing is the sort of name that you get in the Gallic style. Not a surname as such. Now let's look at these Stuarts, because they're quite important to the big picture of what happened in Scotland. The Stuarts, as we know, you know, the same thing as Jacobites really, but the Stuart kings for many years came out of this origin. This fellow, Walter Fitzalan, was of Norman descent, and he'd arrived in Scotland and was granted land in Renfrew, that's near Glasgow. And he became the first Lord High Steward for Scotland, meaning he was in the royal court. He had this sort of title, steward. And then in due course, his descendants married the daughter of Robert the Bruce. When they died without issue, he became he inherited the crown. So that's and so you get the name Stuart, and then Stuart, as you know, in the more Gaelic way. Then Mackenzies become quite important to the picture, even before the decline of the Lord of the Isles. Mackenzies are allies of the Isles, but they turn on their former overlord and support the kings in Edinburgh rather than the Lord of the Isles kingdom. So that this, just going back to the name, Mackenzie comes from the name Kenneth. You see that there? Like this is John in Gaelic, right? This is Mac, you know, as we would now normally say Mick. And then this is Kenneth in Gaelic. So these are the three. This means John, son of Kenneth. So that's how they get the name McKenzie. It comes from Kenneth. And after the Battle of Largs is regarded as the last of the Vikings leaving. And when the leader of the Vikings was going back to Scandinavia, he died on the way. But this Largs is down in near the Clyde estuary, you know, out from Glasgow. And so it's quite likely, but Mackenzie history is much challenged by different people as being made up rather than based on any sort of evidence. But it's quite likely that the Mackenzies had control of the island of Donan, meaning Donan was a monk, right? And the island Donan is Donan's Island. It doesn't refer to the fort really, but it's in a strategic place there at the junction of three lochs. And so it's quite possible that the Mackenzies, under the Lord of the Isles, had control of Donan's Island and could build a fort there and monitor traffic backwards and forwards, charge different levies and things. But they eventually got that confirmed by the kings of Scotland as they moved across from being supporters of Lord of the Isles to being supporters of the kings in Edinburgh. So in the 1300s, they're strengthening their control on the west coast. And then they take, in 1310 they take up the support for Robert the Bruce against the Lord of the Isles and the Earls of Rothschild. So in due course, you've got the Kenneth succeeding Alexander Mackenzie and styling himself, as they say, of Kintail. So he's, you know, saying, this is my base. Kintail is the base of my operations, meaning, of course, Island Donan, it features in that. And then you have, you know, again, helping the Scottish king, the Stuarts, James III, and he calls himself Kenneth of the Battle. That's a pretty good, pretty aggressive sort of title, isn't it, eh? And then in due course, they remove the MacDonalds from the east of Rothshire, Easter Ross, that's how it's talked about, Easter, you know, it just means the eastern side of Rothshire. So they keep, you know, rising, getting more power and becoming more influential with the Scottish court. And really they're dealing with the Isles and the people who previously ran it. These are quite horrendous times, really, raiding each other and death and wild times. In due course, James IV comes along. At the age of 15, he becomes king when his father died in battle. And he's quite a Renaissance man, really, apart from the fact that he spoke Gaelic, and he was the last king of Scotland to speak Gaelic. He gives himself the title Lordship of the Isles, which was a bit more wishful than it was real. He didn't actually have any control of it, but he gave himself that title. He, a bit later, soon after, he enters into this peace arrangement with England, and in fact, he marries Henry VII's daughter. And of course, it's from this marriage that we get later James VI becoming King of England, because he had this claim through his grandmother, I guess it is, well, anyway, his ancestor, Margaret, being the daughter of the King of England. And so John of Islay is the island out from Glasgow in the Clyde, just up north of the Clyde estuary there, dies. You know, he's the Lord of the Isles. And so the game on now. We've got the, you know, death of the Lord of the Isles. We've got the Mackenzies in charge in Rothshire, and we've got the Campbells being in charge in Argyll, and both being loyal to the kings in Edinburgh. So this is how it's evolving. So the Mackenzies make a play for Lewis by besieging Stornoway Castle. That's Torquil MacLeod, who was the, you know, laird there, and they succeed at that. But James IV himself is killed in battle in 1513. Seaforth is now in control in Lewis, so that's a big part of the empire. And of course, MacLennans are going along there with him. That's why we find MacLennans there. And he becomes Lord Mackenzie. And they set up Brahan Castle, which is there. We'll see that on a map shortly, but that's towards the east of the Highlands of Rothschild. Brahan Castle. I don't know if many of you have been there because not much to see anymore, but it's worth knowing where it was. Then there's this thing in Gairloch. You know, a lot of MacLennans come from Gairloch, the most populated parish probably of MacLennans. How do they come to be there? The MacLennans and their allies had this commission of, have I got my mouse thing happening? No, just turn it on. Had this commission of fire and sword from the king, to remove the MacLeods from Gairloch. It took 100 years, but they achieved it. Amazing story, you know, like it's not really much told today because it's such a terrible thing. And I'd recommend that if you're interested in Gairloch, and even if you aren't particularly interested in Gairloch, I'd recommend this book to you. I can't see my screen where I am, so I better have a look at that. This book here, Gairloch, it's called And Guide to Lochmaree. It's by an author called Dixon, D-I-X-O-N. It's down the bottom there of your screen. You know, it's quite a good book. You can buy it from the Gairloch Museum. This is a reprint. It was a book printed in 1886. And it doesn't have a lot of MacLennans in there as such, but it has a huge amount about the history of each place and the names and how, you know, the iron that was found there, that was a big issue, the iron. As a way of making external income. So with all this going on over all this hundreds of years, we've got from the late 1400s, when the Mackenzies had this little patch in here based initially around Kintail, and now going over into Garve and the Strathconon and so on, but that's all. A couple of hundred years later, 150 years later, you've got them controlling Lewis up here. You've got them controlling Gairloch up here. You've got, you know, a bit further up into that part and further out into the Black Isle and even a bit over here. So, you know, you really got them being quite a powerful lot and capable of raising men to fight in battle, which is, you know, sort of the point of being powerful and supporting the king, thereby supporting the king. So this is Brahan Castle, the HQ of the Mackenzie world. As I said a second ago, built in the early 1600s. And look at the size of it. It's a huge place. I'll show you on a map shortly where it is, but it's over there in Urry that we looked at the last meeting. Built by the Earl of Seaforth. Seaforth, you know, is the name of a loch in Lewis. So it's sort of celebrating his control of Lewis to have that name, Seaforth. When the first Jacobite rising came, it was under siege and forfeited to the crown, you know, because of the rebellious times of the first Jacobite rising. And then it was occupied by General Wade as part of his pacification, as it was called, of the Highlands. So it's quite an important thing in this period of Scottish history. And after the Culloden, you might call it, the second Jacobite rising, as it's known, 1746 was the Culloden. Someone's got a microphone on. Malcolm. Microphone, Malcolm. Yep, thanks. And
question.
Oh, sorry, you had a question? Did you want to ask something?
Yeah, I see it was demolished in 1951.
Yeah, you're jumping the gun now. So during the war, it was occupied by Norwegian troops. There's a bit of a funny thing, isn't it? Having the, you know, former Vikings coming and occupying it as part of the Allied, you know, effort in the Second World War. But then it was demolished. So if you go there today, you just see nothing. There's just a couple of walls and things left around nearby. I went and had a look, but there's not much to see, let me tell you. But it's a big deal in terms of history. So let's look now at the sort of resources that are available. That's setting the scene of, you know, the big picture is, just going back, the big picture is that where you find MacLennans, you also find Mackenzies. Really, it's the other way around. Where you find Mackenzies, you'll find MacLennans, because they went there under the umbrella of the McKenzie control of these areas, you know, meaning the West Coast, you know, around Kintail and so on, Gairloch, Lewis, the East Coast, the Black Isle later, you know, these are all parts that Mackenzie's controlled. So you'll see it in practical terms when you see the who's the minister, or who's the, you know, who are the various officials in those parishes where they are. You'll see the Mackenzie ministers signing the marriage records and controlling the place, you know. Okay, so let's look at what resources there are to help you find where your places are. So you get a name that where someone lived, your ancestor, and you think, well, I wonder where that is. So these are the sorts of, this is a short list of the resources that are at your disposal. There are some fantastic things available, if only you know where to look. You've got the maps that are available on the National Library of Scotland, NLS, maps section. You've got a separate website called Scotland's Places, which deals with the sort of localities and historic names and so on. And in particular, this is a part of this site, this next one, but it's quite an important one. And that's the Ordnance Survey name books, where they went round and asked the people what the names of places were in their districts. You've got a separate Canmore, you know, of course, this is a name that goes back in Scottish history, but the site is called Canmore, and gives you the historic places, more, yeah, like archaeological references, historic references, places that are supposed to be there. And then you've got a book called Place Names of Ross and Cromarty by Watson. Everybody uses that. And don't forget that on our site, we've got a number of maps, especially a really good one about Gairloch that you wouldn't otherwise find elsewhere on the internet. This looks a bit confusing at first, doesn't it? Such a big picture, but really if you get looking at the detail a bit, you'll start to see places that you know already. Here's Urquhart, and we know what the rest says after last week's session, don't we? Urquhart and Logie Wester. That's up there, and of course it comes over here. Look, this is interesting. We talked about Conan Bridge last time. But look, it's not called Conan Bridge here. It's called just Conan, not Conon. Remember I said to you that sometimes in older maps it's referred to as Con, not Conan. And even the river is called Conan. Look at that, there's the river there, Conan River. So not Conon, the way we now call it. So you just got to be a bit flexible on some of these things. Nearly all these little places on here, you will find there are MacLennans staying there. I know all these names from little censuses and the like. So let's just have a look down here. Fairburn, we were looking at a lot last week. Here's Mains of Fairburn. Here's East Mains Fairburn, Cool of Fairburn. See that? Look, they're all there. And then you go down here and you see Fairburn Tower. Now, I didn't show you a picture of it, but I have got a photo, my own photo of the tower. But it features in, you know, these things like the seer of Brahan, for example. Is a story about what happens, and Fairburn Tower features in that. Up here you can see Conton that we've talked about so much before, and look, Conton's an island. This is the black water coming down here that comes down from the falls. Here's Mains of Cool, that's, you know, a place we looked at before. This is an island here, and you can see where it says church there, and manse. See that? There's really a lot of detail. I'd recommend if you have a chance to go to Conan Island, do it. I mean, Conton Island, go do it. It's a great little thing and a lot of history there. Some lovely headstones if you're into that. But what I'm really trying to show you here is Brahan Castle. This is an 1885 map here. So you can see here, Brahan Castle is alive and well in those times, and Mains of Brahan and a chapel. There's actually like a campground, more like a mobile home sort of ground down here in the trees now, but there's not much up here. You can read what there is. You can stay there. There are cabins on the land if you felt like getting connected to history. And Fodderty, we know from before. Jamestown, you see there, there's Jamestown. You remember this place we talked about last time where Jamestown was a little enclave that was established for the free church people because the lairds in Compton and Urry didn't want to have a free church on their own estates. So they made this little enclave. So let's have a look then at this next page, which is from these books that I talked about earlier. On Scotland's places, you see these books that are called Ordnance Survey Place Name Books. And this is the handwritten version of it. And they were made up by the officials who were going to make the maps, going around and talking to people in the significant people in the districts to ask them, what are the places you have around here? And how do you spell them? And what's significant? Where are they? Come and show it to us so we can make a note of what it's like there. So this is a great thing to have if you're looking for some input about your ancestors being there, what this names mean. And I have chosen the page from the book about, you see this is not called a particular parish, see how it's called parishes of Compton and Urry, because it's talking about Jamestown, and it talks, here's the free church, look at that. So we're really getting into the detail that we talked about last week now. Jamestown, and look at this, the person they consulted is John MacLennan. A couple of others they consulted too. I don't know particularly who he is right now. And over here you've got a description of the thing in handwriting, and quite often you'll see them added to. If you look to the handwritten version, you'll see there's been, maybe that's a different handwriting there, huh? That last sentence. Anyway, I've done, save you having to read that writing over there, I've transcribed it here. And it says here, Jamestown, the authority for the spelling, that's the wording from the top of the column. And then it says, this name applies to a small village situated about 1 mile southwest of Strathbeffer, the property of the trustees of Sir R.K. McKenzie of Cool and K.S. McKenzie, Esquire of Bryan Castle. The houses are all one story, chiefly thatched and in middling repair. They don't mince their words. They're not well repaired. They're just in middling repair, and they have thatched roofs, right? That's what it's saying, thatched roofs, not some other style of roof like a heather roof with grass on it. So luckily they've transcribed all these too. So there are two sections you can go into, either the handwritten version or the transcribed version, and of course by being transcribed they can be Google spidered, and you'll find them through a Google search. If you try to get into these things on the site itself, they're very unfriendly. You know, it just has to get to that book that I showed you there. It just has like a long list of chapter numbers, or what you might call like section numbers, and nothing about what's in those sections. So it's a bit tricky to use it in the normal fashion of looking up, here's what I want, because it doesn't have any clue about what's in there, just a county. So best to just Google it from the normal Google search and see what, and put in the words place name book, maybe Scotland's places, and then put the place you're looking for, and hopefully that will find you the reference to the place you're talking about in the transcribed version of those handwritten books I showed you a second ago. Now this is not the same place, of course, that I'm talking about here. This is in the Strathconon, not Jamestown. But it's the same thing, right? They'll just transcribe what was in the other book. And this is talking about a place called Strathanmore. And they've consulted Mr. MacLennan, the tenant of Strathanmore, so that's quite helpful, isn't it? And then it says here, the name applies to a farmhouse situated about 25 chains northeast of the church house of stone, church of the church, full stop. House of stone, 1 story in height and thatched, the property of A.J. Balfour, Esquire of Haddington, who of course is the landlord, the laird of Strathconon, as we've seen. You know, his son became the Prime Minister of Britain in due course. So that's the place names book. I find them very helpful, and I think it might be a way of you getting more detail about what's happening at the place where your ancestors live, what it looked like. Okay. Moving on now to Watson's place names of Ross. And you'll see here he's talking about the sort of origin of these names, like Dingwall. This is the name. I don't know how good your Scandinavian is, Viking speak, but you know, this is what the name Dingwall comes from, this Viking word, which means the plain of the thing, the Norse court of justice, in other words, he says. And Scatwell, which is a place that interests me, he says that's from, see the same word there, for, wool, I suppose, Vur. My phone keyboard's changed over to German keyboard, which is quite nice because I get umlauts on things. I don't know why. It happened yesterday. So the Norse word scat, and scat means a tax, or a tax for grazing privileges. There's quite a little flat area where the rivers join there, the confluence. And you get to, and the best thing I should say to you is that this book is available in archive.org. You know archive.org? You know that? Don't know it? It's a, Stephen, your microphone's on. You can speak. Do you know it?
No,
It's
never heard of it.
You might know that Google were going around for a while, I think in library in Harvard and places like that. And they had a process for scanning whole books and digitizing them, putting them up. And they got to nearly 1 million books or something. And then this thing came along. I think it might have been, I don't, correct me if I'm wrong, but it might have been sponsored by Microsoft, something. This archive.org, and Google just gave them all the books that they had done to date. And in the meantime, they've gone from 1 million to tens of millions of books they have in here, mainly out of copyright books. And this is one of them, because of course it's quite an old book. And, you know, so you can go there, and of course, unlike our site, you can search through the book and find all the references to, let's say, Scatwell or Dingwall or something, and get straight to it without having to look through all the pages or look up an index. So it's really great. So, so if you were looking for Watson's place names of Ross and Cromarty, you could put archive.org into your Google search, and you should find the book and the place in the archive.org. You don't need to buy the book. That's what I'm saying, and you get better access to it by having it digitally available to you, because you can search it. Yeah, try it. That's something to write down. That's something for your notes. Yeah. Watson, place names of Ross and Cromarty, archive.org. It's enormous, millions of books. Now, here's another one. This is a separate site altogether and deals with historic monuments and historic places, not just monuments, really. And this is an example of a place they're coming to. And this, of course, is the Strathconon here. Here's the main centre of the Strathconon. And, you know, in here's where some of you have been to, you see a little word there, cemetery abbreviated. Can you see that? I'm covering it up. It's in the trees there. If you come into here, you come along on the southern side of the river, and then you cross over at Bridge End, of course. And that's where this village is. And there's a big community centre here. In fact, MacLennan gatherings were held there some years ago. And then you go to this little cemetery in the trees down towards the river, and then go on down here. And here's this Strathanmore I showed you in the place name book transcribed version a while ago. And then you come on down here, beautiful glen. This is where that photo I said you're going to see this later is taken from me standing up here looking out this way, you see. So really I'm looking out over Strathanmore when I took that photo of the Strathconon. And then you come along further, and up here you've got, this is where we start our MacLennan Way walk up this track. You see it marked on the map there, through this forest, and then it goes on up there. These rivers aren't very worrisome, you just walk over them. And so this is where you've got to get your transport to, because you can only walk from there. So that lodge that I showed you and is written in the guidebook has said they could organise to get you to this spot here with their, you know, pickup van. And, you know, Malcolm, this is for you. We're getting there. This is the, you know, most extreme end of the Strathconon here, where Malcolm's ancestors lived. And if you look at some books I'm about to tell you about, you'll find there's a large concentration of MacLennans there. I think you can stay at Scardroy Lodge today, just separate accommodation. So here we are now looking at this Canmore site. And here they're talking about Strathanmore, yeah, and this is this property up here, the house. And you can see that all these little reference points all have further information about them. In fact, this name here, however you say it, Druunfern, in fact, that's got an N in there and that's got an M in there. See that? Huh, how about that? Is the name that John in that photo, in that house photo, gives as his where he's living, the address, rather than Strathanmore in the census. In a census, I think 1871 he gives that. So here he is. This is John, John of the photo at the beginning of the show. What do you see here? Let's talk about this. Turn your microphones on. You can, if you feel like saying something. I want you to give me what's your impression of this house? What do you see when you look at it?
Typical croft.
Barbara, what did you say?
It's a typical croft.
Croft, maybe, yeah. What do you think it is? Does it look impoverished to you?
Yes.
No,
Just basic.
Yes and no. That's what I like to hear.
no, it looks like the barn might be attached to the house, and it looks quite large to me.
Yeah. This actually is.
And a spinning wheel.
It's a sort of house for the times you would see in a glossy magazine. Look at this spectacular house this fellow has built. You're laughing, Catherine.
No.
Let me tell you.
Got a couple sheep.
Yeah, it's got a couple of sheep. What more could you want? This wall apparently is still there, but no trace of the house remains.
But don't the sheep live in the house?
Well, that's the question, you see. You know, we'll talk about that in the next slide. But in the meantime, let's just look a bit at this.
Under the house.
Bruce, it has windows which might have glass.
Now we're talking, you see. This is what we got.
And 2 chimneys? Oh my
Yeah, luxury. You see what I'm saying? Glossy magazine material.
goodness. Sorry I missed that era.
So this is it. We know a lot about this John here. This is his number, 668, if you want to look him up. This is his second wife here, sitting, and she's got a spinning wheel there to make wool, you know, to knit some socks or whatever. And this photo is from my friend Ian, who some of you will have met, Ian and Mary from Glasgow. Lovely fellow. He was in the session yesterday. We know that John is, you know, at first I didn't see him in this photo. Anybody tell me where he is?
The corner.
Yeah, he's standing on the corner of the house. I didn't
Standing in the corner.
like every good man should, John. And we know that he didn't build this house a long time before this photo was taken, because he lived in Gairloch. He lived over near Pooleu for a long time and came back to here only in the 1860s. So this is probably the John who they consulted for that book entry that we saw. There he is. And he was a mason when he was in Gairloch. Yeah, a mason. So it means that he had all the latest techniques. He knew, and he could build a proper house, a proper stone construction. And when you see the outside of this house, you can see it's not just a rocky wall. It's got a flattish surface, and it's been lime washed. You know, this is really, we're talking, you know, super mansion here now. And it's got chimneys. This is pretty luxurious stuff. And it's got 2 doors. And as you say, got windows. You know, this is the height of luxury. It's got a drain around the back to stop the floor being too wet. Need I go on?
In Ireland at this time period, there was tax
on anything that would put you above everyone else. And in this
Yeah.
case, you'd have 2 hearth taxes, you'd have a window tax, and the fact that she is a spinning wheel also shows affluence.
Yeah, well, think of that. So, in fact, the laird in the Strathconon, when they reorganised the estate, gave the existing tenants a different place to live, but required as part of their rent conditions that they build themselves a house that had, you know, proper finished stone walls with lime, and that they limed them. So this is part of the sort of ethos of the valley at this sort of time. Like that was in the late 1840s, and now this fellow is getting there in the 1860s, so it's well established by then. So I'll come back to that house business in a minute, but before we go any further, we're talking about the Strathconon, and I'd like to recommend to you this little tiny book. It's not very expensive, £9, and it's a wonderful little book written by the team. Really, it's said to be written by Merrill Marshall, but it's the result of these archaeological surveys that they've done in the Strathconon in the last decade, and she's learnt a huge amount about exactly what happened in different times and who they were connected to and where they went and so on. And is really valuable insight into the daily life of people in this example of the Scottish Highlands in the 1800s typically. So you can buy it from the Archaeological Society, the north of Scotland. So that's not right, is it? Scotland Archaeology Society. Yeah, the S is not there, that's right. So that's the address there, nosas.co.uk. That's in Strathconon, in Conan Bridge. Or at the last gathering, I asked this fellow from this bookshop in High Street, Dingwall, to come along and operate a bookshop in our genealogy day. And he had copies of this book there at that thing. And you can see on the cover, it's got that house. You see? The one we've just been looking at. I asked Ian yesterday if it was his photo they used on the cover of the book, and he ducked the question, you might say. Now, the important thing is that as well as this book that is covering the whole period, within the website itself, there's a link called Past Survey Reports. You see down the bottom of the site of the page there, Past Survey Reports. And there are 4 of those, and this is how you get to find them. So the Phase 2 report includes this picture here that Malcolm's so interested in. And then if you go to the page that's called Past Reports, you'll see down at the bottom of that page, it's called Site Records, actually, the page link. It's got what's called Part 1, Part 2, Part 3, which means Phase 1, Phase 2, Phase 3, Phase 4. And all those reports are there with fantastic amount of detail and all just available free online. So I would strongly recommend you go there and look at that if you've got any interest in the Highlands in general, or in particular, the particular parts of the Strathconon. And this is Malcolm's thing. So you see there, like there's you see, I want you to look at that shape in the river there. I want you to look at this little area here where the main village was, and you can see all these little references. And in the book, they're all, in the report, I mean, one of these reports here, I think it's report 2, they are talking about each of these, what they found in each of these little places as part of their archaeology, surveying it and so on. So this is the same location, and there's that shape in the river again there, and that you can see that rectangular shape is actually there in the grass. Maybe you need to zoom in a little bit more, but this is like, you see, there's this is where we get off to go on our MacLennan Way walk up here. And this is, in fact, there's a big gate here. And I asked somebody in the first of these sessions we had whether that gate, whether they'd gone through there, been able to get through the big gate. And they told me it was open. There were some tradesmen working on something, so they didn't really answer the question. It's probably a good idea if you do want to go down here to look at this part. In Scotland, you know that anybody is entitled to walk over any estate. You don't need to have permission. You're entitled to do it as tramper. The only requirement is you don't, you know, damage things or leave things behind or whatever, but you can walk across. But nonetheless, it's probably not a bad idea to call the estate and say you're coming for a walk up there, and what's the thing about the gate? How do I get in? But yeah, you can do that. So this is Scarborough, and if you want to go on the walk, that's how you do it. Just go to the park there, walk up this hill through the forest, as we saw before. So coming back to the houses themselves then, this is just a little way of making up a model house, you know, like a thing you might put on a model railway track or something to make it look real. Barbara, your mic's on still. But it's quite helpful because you can have a sort of split section of what's going on here. This is the more traditional black house. They're called black houses, yeah. And this one has only one door, right? And here, this is a cow in here, right? So the cows and the cows can't turn right, and the humans turn left when they go in the one door. And in the human section, you've got a bed in here, a chest, and you've got a fireplace, which is in itself a bit of a luxurious fireplace, as somebody pointed out. It's not on the floor, it's actually a raised fireplace. So, you know, that's pretty upmarket. But nonetheless, there's no chimney. So the room is filled with smoke all the time and quite dark, although there are these gaps, no glass involved, but gaps to get some light in because the roof is covered with this, you know, covered completely. And there's a bit of a gap up there, no fire, no chimney, but a bit of a gap you can see. And they tell you to use cotton wool to make it look like smoke coming out. But this could be heather covered in grass. That's a traditional method of making a roof, like grass and earth. Heather, quite sort of strongish and doesn't rot too quickly. But it could also be thatch. Heather. So the roof is a style too. You know, it's regarded as a bit upmarket, a bit more upmarket than the heather and grass to have a roof covered in thatch. It needs to be a bit steeper, I think. And then, so you got in there the cattle feed, you know, in there. Now, these people, of course, would have used the cows that were in here to bleed them and incorporate it into their meals, the blood. And that's where the black sausage comes from, you know, the black sausage that we you sell now as a bit of a curiosity or a luxury item and for breakfast in Scotland. And the blood, you know, they do this in winter when there was no other crops and so on. That would be part of their diet to not kill the animal, but bleed them at the neck. Genghis Khan and his mates, what are they called? You know, they did the same thing with horses. They bled the horses and used the Mongolians. What was their name then? Anyway, they did the same thing. They were able to go for great distances on their raiding because they had the blood of their horses to eat, drink. This is a similar picture. Now, I didn't take this photo, but it's obviously after photography was common, must have been after like 1860, so maybe in the late 1800s. It's on Skye. You can see down here it says West Bay Portree. I took it of a photo on a wall in Dunvegan Castle in Skye. And you can see this one though is not like, you wouldn't put this one in a glossy magazine. No windows. It does have a chimney though, and this is possibly thatch. No whitewash, no lime wash on the outside. So, you know, that's good to see, isn't it? That's another, and here are little houses around here for storing. Perhaps this is a hole for a building for storing potatoes. That was a big thing, potato storing. Otherwise they'd go off over winter, so they would store them often just in the ground, but somewhere to keep them cool. And you can see there's a bit of, this might be a basket for carrying back material, you know, vegetables or potatoes or peat. We'll look at that again too shortly. This is a place where my own ancestors lived over 200 years ago. This is near Scatwell on the lower part of the Strathconon. I was very lucky to be taken there because I was able I had access to the deer stalker from that area who had been in touch with all those people doing the surveys And he could take me there and show me where my ancestors had lived here. This is the base of their house. The thing that's notable about this one, and the other one too for that matter, is that, you know, clearly they didn't use much mortar. They maybe packed it up. You know how they did out in the prairies in Canada, the sort of houses they built. Do you call it cob in Canada? Cob construction? It's not a word I know from human life, only from research. Melanie?
Are you referring to the sod houses?
Sod, is that what you call them?
Yeah, they call them sod houses here.
Cod and sob. It's a tongue twister. Yeah, sod houses. Meaning that you get pieces of turf, you know, and stack them on top of each other. They're in New Zealand. And I've recently heard the term used in Britain, cob houses. I didn't know it myself, any of them. So, but
on the prairies, they had no wood at all, or very, very little. So they just cut big chunks of turf, and I've been in one of them. It's actually really effective at keeping the wind out.
And they had a lot of wind and a lot of cold. They had a lot of cold to keep out. It would have been, there's some of these stone ones might have been a bit drafty, I suspect, but they probably just jammed it up with clay-filled mud, didn't do anything. And of course, what it means is that in due course they just disappear, you know, from the work. People pick up the rocks and go and use them for something else. And so this is the inside of one of these houses. This is a sort of model historic thing. We went to those places south of Inverness at the last gathering. I don't think people were too impressed with it. I don't know about those of you that went, but it was all a bit long-winded and unnecessary. But you got a bit of an idea at some of those places, not as much as you see here. This is that you can see mainly we're looking at this fire here that's just in the open room. Obviously, the room is filled with smoke all the time, and the people smell of smoke. That, you know, part of their life to be smoke. All their garments are full of smoke, and their hair and their skin and so on. Need I go on? And
they used that same technique in the early, like in the Muskoka, Halliburton area, and they used big smudge pots outside. It kept away the mosquitoes and the midges.
The mosquitoes or the midges?
Well, in Canada, it was mosquitoes and black flies, and they burned big pots of smoke just to keep them away.
I suppose if we talk about Scotland, we shouldn't fail to talk about midges. I haven't talked about them yet anywhere.
Exactly.
They're a big deal, midges.
The smoke would have helped keep them. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe that's the trick. Midges, you know, they're terrible little things. They can get through any sort of fly wire. They're tiny and they bite, and the bites don't go away like mosquito bites after half an hour or so. They last for days. It's an awful thing. And, you know, they joke that the chief joked to me. He said, well, whenever we get a good sunny day, we know the midges will be out. So you can't really go out in the open even then.
No.
Midges. So let's talk about like this sort of crofter life, as you might call it, meaning self-sufficiency. That's really basically what it means. You know, even in later times, we see these people living in houses, often with quite large families, you know, maybe 10 children, maybe 8, a lot. And they've got their occupation as farmer of 1 hectare, 1 acre. 1 acre is nothing, you know, like what we call a hobby farm today is like 10 or 20 acres. If you're talking, you probably understand acres, not hectares. You know, it's amazing how little land they lived on, these people. Some, in earlier times, they had shared pastures, you know, particularly in the summer months, they'd go to the shieldings up in the mountains or in more inland places that were too cold in the winter. And the women and children would generally go there while the men stayed back home. That was more the cycle of life, often looking after cattle or sheep in those, and in common with others, they would go to these places. In the time we're talking about, that is the late 1700s, the potato had only recently been introduced. I tried to, when I was in Peru this year, I asked about where the potato had come from in South America, and they weren't that sure really, but I gather it was probably Peru around there. So it was only after the conquistadors and, you know, Columbus before that, that the potato became available to Europe at all. And that's not that long before the period we're talking about. And in the notes about the Scottish Highlands, they talk about how the potato has recently been introduced into our valley in the late 1700s. They're talking about that. So it made a big difference to their populations and their health, of course, to have potatoes available, particularly able to store them over winter. They probably built their own homes with the help of their neighbours. They didn't need people to come in and do it much. They used peat for heating their houses and cooking. They made their own clothes out of the sheep that they kept around the place, meaning, you know, jumpers, and cotton became more available in the 1800s, but before that they were all wool. Clothing, you know, I don't know about woolen underpants, but you know, woolen tops, woolen coats, woolen trousers, woolen socks, and so on. Bleeding the cattle for the black pudding I've already mentioned, and oats. Maybe you don't have any oats anyway. So I just want to talk for a minute about estates and what it meant to them. You know, this is really going back to that talk of feudalism that we talked about before. And the estates were about having available men who could go and fight on behalf of their chief, and in turn the person to whom the chief was obliged. And we talked about them being often of Norman origin. But in these times we're talking about, that is the 1700s, 1800s, we're getting people who have made a lot of money in India, like you see that in say Olness, which is up north of the Black Isle. You see the area there owned by McKenzie family, and they'd gone to India and made a lot of money, and they've got this gate up on the top of the hill there above Olness that is called Friarish Gate. You know, it's a mock-up, a model based on some gate in India, one of the towns, I think, on the west coast of India. It's on the top of the hill. This sort of illustrates how they made all this money and came back all fired up to spend money on the estates and make fancy houses and so on. But they were, of course, more local people. Then others were incomers. You know, they're often landlords from other parts of the world, as we saw in the Strathconon. That Balfour was a person who had made money in India supplying the Navy, and he had all this wealth that he could buy the estate from the former Mackenzie owners. And also just money made in business in Europe, in Britain too. You know, those people like the next owner of the Coombs, the owner of Strathconon after the Balfours, was had made money in breweries. You know, Watney's beer, that's part of that you see quite commonly in Britain. That is the descendant of his brewery. So he used his money he'd made from the brewery to buy the estate from the Balfours. So if you were called a tenant, you were actually quite well off. You think tenant, well, that sounds like a bit of insecure situation, but a tenant is someone who's got an agreement to stay on the land probably for a period like 5 years or 10 years or something, and has some incentive to improve it. But of course, if you're just there sort of squatting, you might say, then you've got a bit more of a problem, or subletting and so on. Often the rent on these properties is not paid in money because they didn't have much money. You know, you can think that people hardly ever had money in their pocket. A very rare thing. They would pay the rent in their produce, like it might be their grain, it might be in cattle, number of cattle, or it might be if you're out on the islands or whatever where fishing is the only source of income, you would pay part of your catch to the laird as part of your rental arrangement. The grain side of it, of course, the laird often controlled the mill in their parish and required that the tenants process all their grain through the laird's mill and give the part of the produce to the laird to use. And the laird had responsibilities too, of course, you know, to build bridges and to maintain roads and various other things that were more like provide a school teacher, we'll see later. This is a bit later photo that was sent to me by my friend Donnie in Falkirk. It's more about taking a photo of this Telford Bridge here. Thomas Telford, you know, made all these bridges all over the place. But it's meant to show us, you see there's a man in here with his back to us? That place there is where the people who went, the MacLennans who went to New Zealand and gave all those names to towns and mountains and everything, MacLennan Mountain, MacLennan River, MacLennan Township, and the mountains named after their children. They came from this little part here. And by this stage, this is 1898, we're seeing that the houses have slate on their roofs. The other house, that might be a living house, might not, with thatch and rough walls. But you see, these are quite respectable looking places over here. And this house up here, it was known as the MacLennan House, that one. If you go across that bridge, this is in Duernish, on the way from Loch Alsh village to Plockton. You go over this bridge. And just up there at the top there, this is the MacLennan House that I've had.
Bruce, did you visit that and send me a picture?
Could I send? I've got a picture, my own picture of that house. Is that what you mean?
Send that to me?
Oh yeah, that could this photo or another one I sent you.
Another one. I think you visited my cousin there.
Yeah, that's it.
Is that the same one?
Yeah, that's it.
I'm going to take a screenshot of it. That's very cool. Thank you.
I'll take the thing away. Yeah, that's John MacLennan. He was a piper at the castle. You know, the Matheson Castle on the other side from Plockton. Quite a well-known character. I had such a lovely time when I went to this place. You know, I was in touch with someone. I don't think it was you, Catherine, but someone in the US who had put me on to talking to a woman in.
Please, it was
Ishbel.
me.
Was it
My
you,
cousin.
Ishbel?
My
Ishbel.
cousin, Ishbel.
Ishbel, she's so lovely. But I couldn't ring. You know, I'd had this contact by email, but I couldn't ring to find out any phone number or anything because the time zones were wrong and I was driving through there. So I went to this. I just went into the village of Duernes to look at what was there, and I knocked on a door just right here. I didn't know at the time it had any significance. And they came out and they said, "You see across the paddock there are those red cows walking up the street. That's Ishbel's house." So I just bowled over there and and knocked on the door, and she was so lovely. Thank you for the introduction. She said to me a bit after we'd been there chatting for a while, she said, "You know, I just knew there was somebody coming today because when I got up in the morning, I took some pancakes out of the freezer thinking there might be someone come today and it'd be nice to have some pancakes ready." Lovely. And then she took us round to hear her grandchildren play the harp and, yeah, it was really a nice experience. I'd recommend it always, you know, to go and do these sort of things. I turned off my mobile, but this is the landline. Yeah, so that was great, Dernish. And this fellow, Donny, I've been to see him too. He lives in Falkirk. He's very knowledgeable about all these people and places and done a huge amount of research. Fantastic resource. I'm just showing you this because this is part of the life of people living in that whole period for places where there was no tree cover and you needed some way of making a fire. They would use the peat. So some of you want to know more about peat, what it means? Basically, they cut this, you know, in the hillsides, they cut these 18-inch, you might call them 450 millimeters wide trenches with these special spades and make these rectangular shaped pieces, which they leave by the side of the trench to dry for a while, a couple of weeks, depending on the weather, in a sort of stack that allows the air to get through them and dry out a bit. It just saves you carrying water around because often they're out on the middle of a hillside where you can't take a car, it's too boggy. So they carry them back in baskets usually after they've dried out a bit, and then they stack them up near their house and use it for their fire. You know, if you go to places like Shetland today, you'll see heaps of these trenches and the stacks of peat beside them today still, because there are just no trees in Shetland, too cold, like, you know, tops of mountains. And this is not an old photo. These are two people who married only in this is their number, his number. This is 1961 they married, these two. So, you know, it's still a bit going on today. This is the main thing you got to know about. If you got, this will be on the exam, this one. The main source of income to Highlanders was cattle. There you go, I said it. And this is what they look like. Those red ones that we see so commonly, they're more like, they say, they're more like a Victorian idealised version of what a Highland cow should look like. This is the black ones are the more traditional Highland cattle, and they're said to have come in the very earliest times. You know, back in the retreat of the Ice Age sort of time, with the migrants who came into the north of Britain in those early times, and they bred them up. They had them in their house, living in the other end of their house with them. They were quite docile, manageable animals, but hardy. You know, they can withstand quite extreme colds. They're quite placid. They can eat things that other animals won't eat, other cows won't eat. They can even use their horns to dig into the snow and get food. So this is a handy thing to know, to have as a pal, if you're looking for some tucker over winter. Of course, they also had fishing, you know, in the parts that have good fishing. You know, even in Loch Newick, the herrings would arrive in September each year, and they knew to expect them, and they'd have their teams ready to go and catch a good load of herring and other fish out on Lewis and other places in the north. Don't forget that some of this fishing work, because it was seasonal, meaning that the herrings came at a particular time, or they didn't want to fish in winter, was often seasonal, and people would leave their glens in the inland of Scotland and go and work for a short period in, say, Caithness, you know, up on the top of Scotland there, where there was a huge herring catch. You know, you've only got to go there even today and you'll see where the legacy of this herring activity. So people would go and earn seasonal income, and the same applies to the ag lab, you know, the agricultural labourer who we see a terrific amount in censuses and so on estates, as if they live on the estate and work there permanently. But they too, even in times gone by, would go off and do casual work, bringing in a harvest or that sort of thing that you don't think about so much as being seasonal income. Keeps them going through the winter. Women more likely were domestic servants who would be a domestic servant in their local area, or sometimes they too would travel to be a domestic servant, let's say for an aunt or an uncle in some distant part. And illicit whiskey, don't forget that. That's an important source of income for many of these people in the remote Highland valleys. I bet in Corrievuick they had some, Malcolm, illicit whiskey, I guarantee that. And then a lot of people went off to be soldiers. There were so many wars being fought and so on, you know, not only the wars with Indians and whatnot in America, and wars in India and other parts, that they would go off and earn income from soldiering and being in the Navy too. Now, let's talk about the bigger picture of what's happening in this time we're talking about. And I want to just briefly talk about the Enlightenment and science. You know, I gave a talk earlier this year. If it took 2 hours to talk about the Enlightenment, I'm going to give you 3 bullet points about it today that'll last about 30 seconds. I was going to put a picture of this for this slide of Watt's steam engine in here, and that's a hellishly important thing that happens in the 1700s. But prior to that, you have this wonderful, wonderful person here, George Buchanan, who I think trumps the steam engine, so cop that. You got to know about him. He was there before the 1600s. He was a senior tutor to James VI. In fact, he's known to have given James VI a few good hidings when he didn't study his Latin and that sort of thing. He was a language scholar, spoke many languages, Latin, Greek, French, Portuguese, Spanish. He spent time in Paris working as an academic. He spent time in Coimbra, you know, the famous academic institution there. And it's him who for the first time recognized that the Gaelic he was a Gaelic speaker, that's another one of his languages. And he was he was the one who recognised that the Gaelic spoken in Scotland was a related language, was part of the same family of languages as the language spoken in Brittany, in France, in Wales, and in Cornwall, you know, the other, what we call today Celtic countries, and thereby making a connection back to these ancient roots of the Celtic culture that we know in Scotland. You know what? The best place I ever saw for a museum that addressed the Celtic peoples was in Madrid. That's amazing, isn't it? And DNA seems to be showing too that the Iberian Peninsula was a source of migration into Ireland before they came across. Now, I'm speculating here, but you know, that's something that is now open for suggestion. And there's a great book, Blood of the Celts, which I haven't talked to other people about. Whoops. Blood of the Celts is a great book about that talks about the Iberian Peninsula as being connected to the other Celtic people. Okay, anyway, that's George Buchanan. Enough for him. You got to know that Scotland punched above its weight in the Enlightenment and had quite an influence on, you know, these Enlightenment ideas that became enshrined in the American Constitution. All men are created equal. You know, that's a great book about the Enlightenment in Scotland. No less modest than to say the Scots' invention of the modern world. Herman is the author. Some of you would have read it already. And then essentially the Enlightenment comes down to, you know, we talk about equality, but really we mean treat others as you would like to be treated. That's really the bottom answer. So I've said enough on the Enlightenment. Fantastic subject. Then you've got science, you know, the application of science to practical issues like the steam engine is a huge thing, you know, not just into the mills and doing away with hand weaving that we saw there before, but you know, it means that this is why we're going to have sheep in the Highlands in a minute. You've got steam engines driving these looms in these factories instead of water power. You've got steam engines driving trains in due course, and then driving ships. Goes on and on. You've got the development of the clock, and in turn that creates the ability to measure the place at sea. So you've got navigation that opens up the world for migration. You know, Cook took with him on his great voyages the Harrison clock that allowed him to do that wonderful navigation. Of course, don't forget Cook was at the time of the Plains of Abraham, meaning the conquest of the citadel at Quebec City, that Cook was in the St. Lawrence Seaway navigating for the British side in that time, several decades before he went on those long voyages. And you got this, it's really called the Age of Reason. That's another name, the science and discovery, this practical application of scientific method. So broadly, here's your broad sweep of history during this time. You know, you've got John Knox creating the Scottish Reformation, comes back from Geneva. You've got in 1603, James VI becoming the James I separately of England. And in the late 1600s, you've got the tumultuous time of, you know, the regicide and the Commonwealth, and then taking over by Anne and Windmill Will. And then in 1707, you have the Acts of Union. Don't expect that everybody was in favour of union of Scotland. This is, we're saying James here was separately King of England and Scotland. And here we're saying that the two come together to form Great Britain. Don't forget, though, that quite a lot of Scots didn't like the idea of the Union. They thought they were going to get swamped by Westminster. And that turned out to be true, probably. And then not long after, in 1714, you have the first German, you might say, not really German, they're really from Hanover, because, of course, they were separate princely states there. He was a hopeless king. He was absent and, you know, didn't speak English, and was not interested particularly in running the place or being a... So it's no wonder he wasn't all that popular. And of course, this is when you have the first Jacobite rising in here, just after 1715. In response to this, this was after this one here, we have the destruction of the Eileen Donan Castle. After this one, you have the first Jacobite rising, 1715. And then after, in 1745, you've got the Prince Charles coming with his people in 1745 and then ending in tears in Culloden Moor in 1746. So following 1746, there was clear suppression of the Highland way. And it's very enlightening to read some information about what happened here. You know, they were described as Highland Army. They weren't really. They had French regulars, Irish regulars. They used modern European techniques for fighting and so on. But Highlanders are treated like other, like outsiders. You know, there's that term other. They're treated in the same way that natives of foreign lands were treated. They're shunned and suppressed. And then, of course, later you have the French and Indian War, started off by the British soldier called George Washington. British soldier called George Washington, you're saying? No, it's true. He was, you know, that's what he was when this was before the Revolution. And in turn, the French and Indian War, as it's called, led to the 7 Years' War in Europe, which was a pretty awful affair. And Highlanders begin, at this time now, we're having Highlanders beginning to migrate, particularly to the Carolinas. Some went to the Caribbean, and some went to the Hudson Bay Company, and then after Plains of Abraham to Lower Canada, meaning Quebec, and particularly on the south side of the seaway, not and up the channel towards Ottawa. And from 1792, almost wholly until the Battle of Waterloo, we have Britain at war with France. This is a huge thing, you know, people are being drawn out of the Highlands, they're being exposed to other cultures and other people and other languages and coming back with all sorts of funny ideas, feeling a bit more like they know more about the world and feeling like they might be worth leaving. The Carolinas. You know, the Carolinas were a bit different in their development. A lot of the settlers who were the Carolinas were not that early, weren't settled the same sort of times as Virginia and Jamestown and so on. They were settled much later. And quite a few people came from the Caribbean, you know, Barbados and Jamaica and those places to the Carolinas. So the application of this scientific method, we've got these fantastic resource available to you to find out about the late 1700s called Old Statistical Account. Anybody put their hand up who's seen them before? Who likes it? You don't know it? Oh, it's wonderful. These are things they call, it's totally in line with the age of reason, the age of science, the Enlightenment, this sort of stuff. And this guy was from Caithness, you know, Thurso, that's a well-known herring port. Ulster became a member of Parliament for Caithness, and he was passionate about the reform of agriculture. That's a very Enlightenment idea, isn't it? And these things were written in the 1700s, 1790s, over 900 reports by the ministers in those parishes. Don't forget, probably the ministers were the only people who could write English, probably some of the few people who even spoke English in those parishes. Nearly all were Gaelic speakers in the Highland parishes. And they were given sort of headings to write up about their place. And they were not meant to be at all ecclesiastical. They were meant to be like economic or historical or scientific, you know, more these sort of topics. So what's the geography like in your parish? What's the history of your parish? Well, how does the economy work? You know, how does it get income in from outside? What do people earn income by? What sort of numbers of people? What is their nature? You know, sometimes they talk about having how many people are on welfare and how many people are, you know, habitual drunks and that sort of thing. And what are their customs? You know, how nice are they to each other and the like. So as family historians, we can learn a huge amount from looking at these old statistical accounts. Now, the ministers, of course, didn't write them all in one day. That's why you have these 8 years here. But they were sent in dribs and drabs. So they're actually sort of spread. They're not like logically organised by county. They're just whenever the order came in, they typed them up and put them into the next volume. So that's what happened with those. This is what the inside title page looks like. And this is how you find it. This is a joint venture, this adina.ac.uk, a joint venture of Glasgow University and Edinburgh University. And so if you put that word into your search, put old statistical account, Adina, I don't know what it means exactly, but it's a bit like Edinburgh, isn't it? And then you can look there for each parish and read it. There are not very many pages about each, maybe 8 to 10 pages on each, and they're small pages. You can't print them or save them, except what I do is I just do a screenshot and paste it into a Word document, and then you've got them all. It's intentional they do it that way. And there's also a new statistical account in the about 1840, around that date. There were new statistical account. And this will tell you a tremendous amount about the places where your people lived, what their domestic life, what their income sources were like, and what their nature was like. This is a really simple example of what you might find, the sort of thing you might find there. So Loch Broom, you know, is a parish that's, today you think of it as being Ullapool up that way, on the north of the west coast, northish. It's in Ross-shire. And as luck would have it, only a couple of years before the old statistical account was written by the minister, who comes from that church where I said Rory was baptised. That's where the minister practiced. But the minister, this place, Ullapool, this is a modernish picture, was only just created a couple of years before the statistical account was written. And so he's writing up about this, how it came about, this thing, this well-meaning society that thought it would be a good idea to build a village for people in destitute countryside to move into and get a source of income in the fishing world. They were somewhat philanthropic, these people. And he talks about a new road being commenced across to Dingwall. What an amazing thing. And so this is that same road we talked about, the MacLennan Way, being superseded by this new road. He talks about the kelp industry. Kelp was a source of income as well, where they collected kelp and made it into chemical to go into gunpowder production. Talks about the animals they have there, and he talks already about people migrating from there. And of course, we know that people had migrated to Cape Breton around this time, so that's very topical for the Cape Breton group here today. And from this very port they'd been leaving. Well, they hadn't left, the main ones we're thinking about hadn't yet left, but they were to leave from that port. He talks about the potatoes having recently arrived in the thing, and he talks about when the herring starts. So this is like very, you see, this is quite important to sort of filling out the detail of the lives of these people who lived in these houses. So I started to think, you know, that you often hear this saying that the people of Scotland have a higher literacy, and that they're well ahead of England and most other European countries in their literacy, education. And I think to myself, is this true in the Highlands? Can this be? You know, we're so often seeing records like this one here, where this is like 1892, right? And we're seeing this person where every bride and groom on this page signs with their mark. Look at that. Kenneth MacLennan, by his X mark. The bride, by her X mark. The groom, by his mark. The bride, by her mark, X. You know, these are not literate people. You've got to think, well, these aren't people. Why did that come about? So I thought to myself, how can I try and understand this better? And so I thought about education in the Highlands. Well, they're all Gaelic speakers, of course, so they need to understand the world in Gaelic because they're not going to learn in English. So we know in general, John Knox supported education. This might be why the Lowlanders were learning things, but the Gaelic Bible hadn't been translated till the New Testament in the 1760s and the Old Testament in 1800-ish. But still the education was lacking. What we learned I learned by reading all the old statistical accounts for the Highlands was that the schools were meant to be provided by the laird, by landlord. That was one of the things they should have used the rent for. And the school masters' pay should have been looked after by the landlord. But clearly that's a bit of a difficult thing, you know, to get Gaelic-speaking teachers to come and live alone, and there wouldn't be many from the local population who could do that. So we had these other couple of philanthropic organisations. This one, the Society in Scotland for Propagating Christian Knowledge, around this time was motivated as much by a political agenda as Christian agenda to make good Georgians of them. You see the timing of the dates here? So once you know the broader sweep of history, you know that one of their agenda items was to make them loyal to the Hanoverians. Go out there and tell them what wonderful people the Hanoverians were, how they were going to look after them. And then later you had this other philanthropic society, but it's much later. And so I thought, well, so these are the two types of schools, what's called the parochial schools, and these are the other schools. So I looked through all the old statistical accounts there, you know, for both all of Ross Shire and all of Inverness Shire, and I counted up the total population, 122,000 people, and I looked at how many parochial schools they mentioned and how many other schools. This is the non-parochial, non-Laird's ones, the philanthropic ones, as you might say. And so these are only mentioned, and sometimes they say has just been started or has recently closed. We're hoping to get another teacher again soon, or this sort of thing. So these are not very many to educate this number of people, or at least their children, really. So I worked out roughly what percentage of the population would be children, and I divided it into these schools, and I concluded broadly, you know, this is a pretty rough method, really, not very scientific. You wouldn't like it, Stephen. Too rough and ready. But I had to get something. So I thought, well, that probably means that if you think how many children there would be in this number of people, that a quarter of the population would be able to attend school for about 5 years. Only a quarter. So maybe that answers the question. It helps anyway. And another factor in this education standard was that there was a consistent thing written up by these ministers to say that school masters in those districts were poorly paid. And many of the schools were not located very close to all the people, of course. Some were just inaccessible. Kids couldn't go to school because they were too far away. They might go and stay with a relative in town while they went to school sometimes, but other times there were not enough schools. Let's talk now about the emerging new sources of income in the 1800s that might help to lift the people in the Highlands out of poverty and destitution. And these are the sorts of ways they might have earned some money here. Tell me, you can turn your mics on if you want to talk about this. What sort of way might the railways have helped them in the Highlands to improve their sources of income? Melanie?
There'd be an increase of trade and goods coming in from the cities for manufacture and a way to get their goods to the cities to sell.
Yeah, the Highland Railway came to Inverness in the 1860s, thereabouts. A bit earlier than that, 1850s. And then the Highland Railway went off to other parts in the 1860s. It didn't eventually get to Lochalsh until the 70s. It ended at Strome Ferry for a while. Yep. Stephen, you were going to say?
Basically the same thing. They could sell.
Ah, there are two Stephens. Well done. Stephen Pelsu.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. Was probably for trade and a better means for them to be able to perhaps build a trade through the source of wool and so forth, you know, from their sheep.
Uh-huh.
You know, a monetary income instead of a trade income.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's an idea. Stephen.
How about tourism? Tourism.
Sorry?
Tourism.
Yeah, it was really like, you know that, funnily enough, Prince Albert, you know, the Victoria's consort, was husband was very keen on the Highlands and popularised it, and you know, made a big effort to, and that thereby increased the people wanting to go to live in the Highlands or own estates or whatever. But this was like after Queen Victoria came to power in the middle of the 1800s. No, it wasn't. None of that's what I was thinking of, really. I was thinking that unlike going off to do a harvest in the south of Scotland, in the Lothians and borders, they, in those early times when there was such a rush of railways in the 1840s, they could go and join these great gangs of navvies, as they were called, people who had previously built canals, became railway line builders, making cuttings and culverts and drains and laying track. And later you see often the role of plate layer is a common thing to see in our MacLennan clan occupations, plate layer. But these gangs of navvies were like 2,000 and 3,000 people at a time, and the income for them was 20 to 30% greater than the income that was earned by agricultural labourers, you know, ag labs going to do harvesting. And it lasted a lot longer, of course, than just bringing in a harvest for a few weeks. It lasted for months. So it was a good source of income to go and work on the navvy gangs, making the railway lines in the early 1800s. And then, of course, you know, somebody said yesterday their family had all these jobs of, you know, railway jobs, engine drivers, station masters. You know, we see quite a few of those new jobs that emerged in the once the railways did arrive to that part of the world. And then shepherd. Let's talk about shepherd. Of course, that's an occupation that comes when you start getting these sheep. I always take a bit of care with this, the way to pronounce this sheep's name. But I gather it's Cheviot, like that. Cheviot, that's how they say it in Scotland. I asked a couple of people, and that's the clue I got. It's some hills in the north of England, but quite a good sheep. This was the sheep that they all regarded as the demon, you know. But actually, a lot of MacLennans managed sheep farms, were shepherds. There wasn't, of course, barbed wire was quite a new, you know, latest technology in the late 1800s. And in fact, some MacLennans I've seen as their occupation, wire fencer. So you need a shepherd, of course, was needed when you didn't have any fence. But once you had people being wire fencers, you had then no need for shepherds. And then you had butchering in Scotland, most commonly known as flesher. A lot of MacLennans were fleshers, butchers. A lot of my ancestors were fleshers. Seemed to be quite a big occupation in various towns all around the place, heaps of them. And then you've got the game. Once the estate owners came in, they made parts of their estate for deer, for game, shooting, various types of shooting birds and various things. And deer stalker was quite a well-known occupation. There's a really good book about that, Duncan MacLennan in Glen Affric. And then many left to work in manufacturing operations in the towns like Glasgow and Dundee and Aberdeen, places like that. Some went to sea as merchant, particularly those who'd been brought up by the sea, went off to work in the merchant service as seamen, and some navy people too, of course. And then you've got these middleman type occupations like grocer and shoemaker and tailor. Some went moved with that occupation, not just within Scotland either, moved to Liverpool or other parts of the country to be tailor or grocer or whatever. These are some of the emerging things. So that's sort of our topic really. We've talked about the clan allegiances that caused us to be living where we live. We talked about how and where you might access place names on maps and other resources like Scotland's places and Scotland's and the books. We talked about the sort of income that these people might have had in the pre-modern times, and crofting, self-sufficiency. Talked about the coming of the scientific revolution and the age of enlightenment, and we talked about the sort of housing they had in domestic life and their rights to use property.